Sok tisztelettel és szeretettel köszöntök mindenkit itt a 4. Pestet fesztiválon. Engedjétek meg, hogy bemutatkozzak, engem Tar Ferinek hívnak, én vagyok ennek a fesztiválnak az házigazdája itt az elkövetkezendő napokban, úgyhogy ha bárkinek bármilyen kérdése adódik, akkor nagyon sok szeretettel várom itt a szünetekben. Nem is szeretném nagyon rabolni az időt, hiszen világos, hogy mindenki a most következő beszélgetésre érkezett, azonban szeretném fölhívni a figyelmeteket, hogy holnap után, sőt azután is itt folyamatosan zajlanak a programok a Három Hollóban, érdekesebbnél érdekesebb beszélgetések a világ minden tájáról érkező szerzőkkel, igazi sztárszerzők is érkeznek, és nem csak itt a Három Hollóban, hanem a holnap kezdődő budapesti nemzetközi könyvfesztiválon is lesznek a Pestet tervezésében beszélgetések. Én arra bátorítok mindenkit, hogy itt szerte-széjjel láthatjátok ezeket a különböző programfüzeteket, bátran vigyetek belőle, és szemezgessetek bízva abban, hogy még találkozunk bármelyik másik programon. Valamint engedjétek meg, hogy fölhívjam arra is a figyelmeteket, hogy nem csak beszélgetések zajlanak a Pestet Fesztivál keretén belül, hanem nagyon izgalmas társművészetekkel kollaboráló performanszok is, általában az esti órákban itt a Három Hollóban. Így a mai nap is lesz este 9 órától V4-es költők érkeznek, akik szabadság, szerelem tematikában alkottak mindenféle szövegeket, amit a Jazz Zaj nevű improvizatív társulat zenei formába önt, és ugyanígy koncertek lesznek holnap este is, holnap után este is, amire nagyon sok szeretettel várunk titeket vissza, akár egy jó sör vagy egy jó bor után, lehet, hogy még jobban is fog tetszeni. De most akkor át is adnám a mikrofon, nagyon jó elmélyülést kívánok a témában, Kulcsár Szabó Zoltáné a szó.
Köszönöm szépen! Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a pleasure and honor for me to welcome Jonathan Culler here tonight, or this evening. The occasion of his visit to Budapest is the publication of his very short introduction to literary theory in Hungarian, which came out a few months ago at the publishing house Szeptember in the translation of András Gáspár Piko and Péter Füzi. Both of them are present here. So that's it. Jonathan Culler was a professor of English and comparative literature at Cornell University, where he is now Professor Emeritus, as far as I know, and he's, as we all know, a leading expert in the fields of literary theory in general, comparative literature. He was a professor of English and comparative literature, and his work includes several monographs on theoretical classics, on general topics of literary theory. I would like to mention just a few of his books, his monographs on Flaubert, on Ferdinand de Saussure, Roland Barthes, and there is a monograph on deconstruction, which most of us maybe know in Hungarian translation to it. This is the book, and I forgot to show you the current publication. This book on deconstruction is part of all mandatory reading lists and literary theory courses in Hungary. So he's a well-known author. He's been a well-known author for decades, or more than a decade in Hungary also. Further, I would like to mention his collections of essays on semiology, semiotics, which include publications also on essays on issues like tourism or rubbish theory. So these are, I think, experiments with cultural studies avant la lettre, if you like. Back to this book on literary theory. It's part of a prestigious series, very short introductions by Oxford University Press. First edition came out in 1997. The Hungarian is based on the second edition of this book, which is a very successful book. It has been translated into more than 20 languages, as far as I know. And I can show you the German one. It's a in the series of Reklam. And the critics emphasized its structure, the structure of this book, because it's in contrast to most of books of this sort. It does not include chapters on subsequent theoretical schools or movements, so it's not in the sense a historical survey, though there is an appendix in this book which orients us in this respect, but it's organized around basic concepts such as narrative, such as poetic language, performative language, interpretation, and so on. Which enables to confront different theoretical approaches toward these general topics. Among these topics, one finds the theory itself, and this is very interesting. A book on theory begins with the question of theory as a question that what do we do when we are doing theory? This is a question that we all pose to ourselves more or less desperately sometimes, and this is what I want to begin with. Can you outline your concept of theory in relation to the more general concept of criticism on the one hand, and let's say to philosophy on the other?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in Budapest. I first came to Budapest in the summer of 1977 when things were different. One of my main recollections from those days, that was a conference at the International Society for Comparative Literature, International Comparative Literature Association. But one of my main recollections from those days is the impossibility of deciphering any of the signs anywhere. But now there are many more English signs. That's progress. I'm glad that there's some translation is taking place in Hungary these days. It's a special honor to be included in a literary festival where this is not something that usually happens for a literary critic to be allowed to gather together with writers, and I'm very pleased to have this occasion, and I'm especially pleased at the handsome translation that has been produced by the publisher and the translators. It's more elegant, better produced than the original, I would say. Except that the original has cartoons, which are unfortunately omitted from the Hungarian edition. So theory, what is theory? It's in part, I don't know how special this usage is in English, whether it's really comparable in other languages, but certainly at the time, back in the end of the 20th century, people in literary and humanities talked a lot about just theory, for short, not theory of anything, or not really literary theory, and that is something of a puzzle. That that this was sort of shorthand that we used for a concept that was kind of ill-defined. In this book, I end up defining it really as thinking that originates in one particular academic field, one particular domain, and that proves fruitful, proves inspiring for work in some other domain. Because certainly that's the way theory sort of evolved, that literary critics would start reading philosophers or linguists, historians might read psychoanalysts, etc. That sort of interdisciplinary cross-fertilization was what gave rise to theory. And it was sort of unpredictable which works would make it into a kind of theory canon. That some historians made it. In the U.S., Hayden White became as a theorist of history, became part of theory. Other historians who might have had theoretical ambitions somehow didn't make it into the canon. Freud and Lacan certainly made it into the theory canon, and sometimes other psychoanalysts, but not everybody. So it's really a rather diffuse concept, and it made it difficult, especially difficult for students. Made theory rather intimidating because it was a sort of an open-ended, endless commitment. If you're trying to do theory, someone else can always tell you, well, but you haven't read so-and-so. How can you claim to be a theorist if you haven't read X or Y? So, but that's the way I started the book off, with this discussion. I did then take two examples of theory from Derrida and Foucault, two leading figures in theory, because in addition to inspiring work in fields other than those in which it originates, theory was characteristically countered or upset or undermined common sense notions of one sort or another, and that's sort of what made it theoretical. It produced arguments against various ordinary ways of thinking, and that's one of the things that made theory most exciting, of course, both for students and for professors, but also upsetting. There was a time, there was a cartoon in the original version of this book, which was already outdated after 9/11, after the attack on the World Trade Center and 9/11, etc. It was a woman introducing her boyfriend to the family, and the father says, "You're a terrorist, thank God. I understood meant to say you were a theorist." I say, back in those days, in the 1990s, when theory was said to be a danger to Western civilization and undermining Western culture and that sort of thing, this cartoon made sense. After the attack on the World Trade Center, it didn't make sense anymore. But there was, in a way, this originated in a very exciting time when to be a theorist was to be a dangerous person, out to unsettle many common conceptions.
Thank you. You referred to the use and notion of progress in Hungary, so I would like to put it in another context, and mainly in the context of theory, because you have devoted some pages to death and or triumph of theory. This is also in a chapter on theory itself, and this is, I think, a very urgent question also in Hungary. Is the high time of theory now over? And if it is, does it mean the death of theory, or is it rather, I would say, a triumphant termination of theory? And I would like to, I have a quote from, actually from the foreword to the second edition of your book, Pursuit of Science. I would like to quote your conclusion of this foreword. I hope that 20 years from now we will be closer to a comprehensive theory of discourse and discourses than we are today. That was, end of quote, that was 21 years ago. And of course the question arises, are we closer now? So that was my next question. Does theory still progress in this sense, or has it reached its peak?
Very, very interesting. I think of those as two sort of separate questions, really. First, certainly theory as such is no longer such a flashpoint, no longer some source of such great controversy. There are certain, in the U.S. at this moment, Republican legislators, they're very exercised about something they call critical race theory, which they have just discovered, which argues that American culture is systematically racist, that racism is not simply a matter of an individual attitude or psychological attitude on the part of individuals, but is something structural, is something that has been a notion that's been around in academic circles for quite some time, and seems very plausible, but somehow it has now become an element of the culture wars in the U.S. with state legislators trying to ban the discussion of critical race theory, whatever that is, in schools or in universities, especially. So there are some aspects of theory that are still highly controversial, or it's seen as something new and dangerous. But for the most part, I would say yes, theory. You're not a high point of theory. Whether that counts as a death of theory, the fact that people keep publishing articles or books about the death of theory, or theory, with titles like Theory After Theory, or things of that sort suggests that theory is certainly is not dead, because you wouldn't need to write books saying it was dead if it were. But I think it certainly, for the most part, at least in the academic world, it's my impression that it's now generally recognized that any sort of critical project has a theoretical, operates in a theoretical framework. So it's no longer a matter of being against theory or denying that theory has any place or any validity in literary and cultural studies. There are different sorts of approaches, and they're no longer quite so much at war with one another for space in academic discourse as they were in the days when the psychoanalytic critics were at war with Marxist critics, or the deconstructionists, or the Foucauldians, or whatever. But whether this counts as the death of theory or the triumph of theory is a difficult question. I use at some point, perhaps not in this book, the analogy with feminism, where at least prior to Me Too movement, feminists in America feminists of my generation were upset that young women often did not identify as feminists. They took for granted the achievements of feminist movements, but did not say, I'm a feminist. And the question is that the death of feminism, or is it the triumph of feminism, when people no longer feel the need to be feminists? Recent developments, especially anti-abortion movements, make it necessary, obviously, again in the US, for people to be feminists, and so there's no longer a question of the death of feminism or the triumph of feminism. But for a while, that seemed to be an open question, was insofar as the achievements of the feminist movement seem to have go without saying. So it's not easy to characterize the current situation. There don't seem to be new particular vanguard theoretical movements. There's certainly a lot of eco-criticism about, partly because of the threat of climate change, but that's a rather fragmented movement with many different sorts of approaches, and not a set of difficult texts like Lacan or Derrida that people struggle to master. The quote from the end of The Pursuit of Signs, yes, that does give me pause. But at least it wasn't a prediction, it was at least a hope, only a hope. I think one of the things that's happened, and been rather curious happened, is that really since the 1980s, I think the place of linguistics, which early on occupied quite a central place in the domain of theory, certainly for structuralism, but also for deconstruction. Derrida thought it necessary to read and write think about censure. But the place of linguistics has sort of dropped out of theoretical conversation, which has made it sort of the project of a unified theory of discourse somehow no longer seems to be on many people's horizon. There's some sense that people working in cognitive studies are aiming at something like that, though their focus is usually different. They in some ways want to get away from language if possible and focus simply on mental operations of the brain. I don't know that is possible, in fact, but that seems to be their hope. So they're not actually, they don't explicitly aim at a comprehensive theory of discourse. What they want is a comprehensive account of mental operations, and the hope usually seems to be that there will be common mental operations in a whole variety of different fields, and to resist the notion of special interpretive operations for in the literary domain, and want to see all those processes as very similar across the board. So so I think I would say we're really not closer, and perhaps in some ways farther away insofar as the goal of a comprehensive theory of discourse and discourses is no longer present in many people's minds, as it was at least at the moment when semiotics was a more active field. I do think I was actively engaged in semiotics at one point, president of the American Semiotic Society. not had anything to do with for, I guess, a couple of decades since. And I think the problem there was it was simply too multidisciplinary that would have tried to gather at a single conference people who were, some people working on animal communication, some people who were anthropologists working on folklore, and others who were sociologists thinking about menu structures and food cultures of various types in different parts of the world, and other people who were working on literary text, and some people working on, I don't know, road signs. It never came together, and the semiotic theory didn't provide us sufficient coherence or it provided some common language, but that didn't suffice to really bring these things together, and people sort of went back into their own more disciplinary or other particular interdisciplinary fields. So no, I'm afraid we're not closer to a unified theory of discourse than we were 20 years ago, I would say.
Thank you. You refer to linguistically based theories, which would kind of offer a more comprehensive approach to the wide field of theoretical research. And you have been, you mentioned also the Saussure, and your book is a quite early book on very informative, and so I would really promote that book. I learned a lot of your monograph on Saussure, and but now I want to turn to structuralism, which was a main focus of your early work. As far as I know, your dissertation was dealt with structuralism, and your book Structuralist Poetics grew out of that dissertation. So I would like to ask whether, how do you see the legacy, if I can put it this way, of structuralism today? So what remained of this theoretical framework, and how was the reception of that basically French discourse in the late 60s or early 70s in the United States?
No, that's a good question. Yes, the really there was not much of a reception of structuralism in the United States. I would say that just as it was, just Robert Scholes and I both published introductions to structuralism, books about structuralism at about the same time, but just about that time there was a famous conference at Johns Hopkins University, which they brought in Derrida and Bach and some other eminent structuralists. Lacan was there too, and at that conference Derrida gave this famous critique of Lévi-Strauss and structuralism, and a lot of discussion at that conference, and had considerable retentissement, has considerable effect on the academic world anyway, and it gave people a reason to think that, oh, structuralism is already passé, or we're now in the post-structuralist age, because Derrida had criticized structuralism. And I find that I'm sort of disappointed in that effect. That it seemed to be. I think it involves in part a misreading of Derrida's essay, which is its critique of Lévi-Strauss, and accuses Lévi-Strauss of a certain nostalgia for a center, and etc., which is eminently true with Lévi-Strauss. So there is definitely that nostalgia. It's a critique that could not be leveled as easily at many other structuralist enterprises. But in my view, what it did was give Americans an excuse to not. And in some ways, structuralism was more complicated than post-structuralism, in that it argued that we should, it argued for poetics as opposed to hermeneutics, that one's task in the humanities should not be to produce new and more complicated interpretations of individual texts, but rather to attempt to understand the underlying structures, the rules and conventions of these various discourses and various cultural practices. And so that's a long-term project, modeled on linguistics. In fact, just as linguistics doesn't set out to tell us what some English sentence really means deep down in ways that we hadn't understood before, but sets out to try to discover what the rules and conventions of this linguistic system are that enable us to produce these noises and communicate with each other. So it basically, post-structuralism gave people some new tools and instruments for interpretation and enabled them to bypass structuralism. But it's striking that the notion of post-structuralism really never caught on in France, where the most eminent so-called post-structuralists were located. Foucault always claimed not to be a structuralist, but he certainly never claimed to be a post-structuralist. Anyway, so that's a rather long-winded answer, but for me, I guess the legacy of structuralism remains quite important, especially the general project of attempting to form a discourse such as literature, lyric poetry, to try to understand the rules and conventions, how this discourse works, how it functions, etc., how it's changed, evolved over time as a system with possibilities, etc. And that for me remains quite important. Saussure, the case of Saussure is quite interesting. I've, for various contingent reasons, remained in touch with the Saussurean community, shall we say, which is very odd. I'm a member of the bureau, I think, of the Société Ferdinand de Saussure in Geneva. This is an international society, which is really strangely cut off from linguistics in general. That the conferences, papers at their conferences are not about advancing our understanding of language, which is what Saussure's project was, but refining interpretations of Saussure and or talking about the reception of Saussure in Japan or in whatever country they are from, or discovering new papers of Saussure's have been discovered and how do these relate to the course of general linguistics. So it's a very strangely, I won't say exactly hermetic, because it is about, a lot of it is about reception of Saussure in other places and other domains, but it's not. I always find it very strange that no one seems to be asking whether this new discovery of some Nachlass of Saussure actually tells us anything new about language. That would be something that we would like to know. So I feel that's become a sort of self-enclosed operation of exegesis and not part of, certainly not part of a larger attempt to understand discourse or language, which is too bad. That was the structure of this project.
In my next question, I would like to address the other term in the title of the book, namely literary. So there is also a chapter on the concept of literariness. If my memory does not. So the status of literature. That's in your concept of theory. That's what I would like to focus on in this question, because it's quite interesting that some of your textual examples are taken from non-literary realms of language, or what Oxford philosophers would say from ordinary language, or it's by Austin and others. So that suggests somehow that literariness can appear or can signalize itself in the fields of language which do not belong to literature in the institutional sense. And I would like to quote a comparison from the book, which is hard to forget if one reads it. Comparison between literature and weed. Here follows this is the quotation. Anyone who has been enlisted to help weed a garden knows how hard it is to tell weed from a non-weed, and may wonder whether there is a secret. What would it be? How do you recognize a weed? Well, the secret is that there isn't a secret. And you later add, perhaps literature is like a weed. So this problem is addressed several times in the book, and there is a follow-up volume with the title "Literary in Theory," and I was wondering whether there is a double sense of this title. So there is the theory of the literary on the one hand, and is there a literary movement in theory itself, in the discourse of theory of the other? So my question would be, how do you simply how do you conceive of literariness in general?
Well, it's a complicated question, certainly, and I wrote a chapter to that and come at it from various angles. The example, the comparison with weed comes from an Englishman named Australian, John Ellis, who made that. That seemed like a clever comparison, that a weed is just something you don't want in your garden, as it were. That's very, certainly, my wife and I have disagreements about this. My view is that anything that's happily growing, we should encourage. And things, she seems to think that only things that that really don't want to grow are the things you have to encourage and plant and water, and rip out the things that are happily growing without being watered or tended. But in any case, because it's very, as we know, the notion of literature is historically complicated. And even in ordinary language, we probably say the literature these days, the literature about climate change is immense, and that doesn't just mean poems and stories, and writing in general, and writings from the past that once were something else now count as literary. You teach the Bible as literature, or people read Herodotus not as sort of a historical source, but as literary. So I do come at this from various angles and talk about the different dimensions of the problem of what counts as literature. There are established literary genres, and then there are literary kinds of effects in writing that does not count as literature. So the title, yes, the literary in theory, is partly about theory of literature, but also about the role of literature in theory of various sorts. And so it's certainly a double meaning there. But yeah, I'm certainly attached to the notion of literature and to the interested of its study. But I suppose the legacy of the point at the moment of structuralism, the literary was not a category of great importance. Literariness in Jakobson's sense was important, but Jakobson's example of literariness was the political slogan "I like Ike," because of the American political campaign long ago. But just because of the way in which Ike, the nickname of the presidential candidate, Dwight David Eisenhower, is embedded in the word "like." How can you not like Ike when his name, the presence of I, only emphasizes that? It's a highly literary, a lot of literariness in that political slogan. But yeah, I don't think I mean I think it's an interesting
volume on deconstruction, and you published a lot of papers on specific problems in demand, for example, and I'm really interested how do you see again the legacy when we, if I can use this word, because after Demand's death and the controversies of around his wartime journalism in the late 80s, the reception of deconstruction seems to have become somehow reserved or more distanced, and there are still publications on Demon's work and also of papers of previously not published papers of Demand, but there is a kind of silence around that oeuvre. So my question is, how do you see the presence or possibilities there still remaining in deconstructive criticism?
Yeah, well, I guess deconstructive criticism is probably a specific question, different perhaps from the question of the legacy of Derrida. Derrida's seminars keep published and translated. I don't know if they get translated into Hungarian, but every year or two brings a lot of papers there. A lot of the work that he did in his annual seminars made it into one or another of his published writing. So it's not as though it's all brand new material, but there is a lot of interesting material there that people do continue to read and follow, at least in French and English. And Derrida wrote about such a vast variety of topics that there's something for everyone there. Its deconstructive criticism was a sort of somewhat curious phenomenon. In fact, what's curious about it is that Derrida's own writings about literature didn't take the form of, didn't emerge sounding like deconstructive criticism, in the sense of criticism that looks, in deconstructive criticism, most to put it in a very oversimplified form, perhaps, was very interested in the ways in which literary works undermined their ostensible message, and something of that sort, that the texts in which texts made themselves unreadable in certain ways, and proved to be more complex than previous interpretations had imagined them to be. And since there's that happens in Derrida's readings of philosophical texts, when he's reading Plato, when he's reading Rousseau, etc. But it doesn't happen so much when he's reading Shakespeare, or when he's reading Francis poem. So there he's not so much explicating those texts as reworking them, rewriting them in a different way to bring out particular interesting aspects of them. So it's not so much a close reading in the traditional either French or American sense, whereas Anglo-American deconstruction certainly did aim to be yet a closer reading than those of the new critics, a closer reading, even more attentive to the potential paradoxes within literary works. So deconstructive criticism as such was a phenomenon of the restricted really pretty much to the 20th century, that hasn't really made it into the 21st century. They're not even. I do find traces of it sometimes in the work of my graduate students. I used to, no longer. I think I only have one left at the moment, which is very good. But when I'd have to tell them, look, you shouldn't take it for granted that to show that this literary work, this work undermines itself, is an unalloyed good. That's not shouldn't necessarily be taken to be the goal of your project. You should find something else to work towards there, rather than. There was a time when that did seem like an adequate goal, shall we say, to show that this work is supposed to do X, but actually I can show that it doesn't. It undermines that project. So yeah, so I think that certainly deconstruction in literary studies brought to people's awareness attention to certain kinds of complexity that can still be discovered in literary works, but usually profitably, it seems to me, in the interests of some other project rather than just that of self-deconstruction, as we used to say. And so I think that's in literary studies that can be the legacy that still has a certain value. But and I'm not sure. I'm glad to hear. I heard the other day that there is an annual Derrida lecture at Pech. This is in Hungary that's being carried on. That's an annual tribute to Derrida, and whether how long that will continue in the current conjuncture, it's not, I suppose, not clear, but that's a good sign.
It was a reference to a series of lectures or conferences at the University of Pécs every year they hold a international colloquium with the title In Memoriam Derrida, so that's a more than that of the modern version of sorry, Hungary. Thank you. One further question. I did not want to leave unaddressed your work on the theory of lyric. This is your latest volume to date, which was published in 2015, and it's a magistral monograph on different aspects and approaches and strata of lyric poetry. Most of scholars in Hungary may have read your article on apostrophe, which is a very popular essay here in Hungary. So every day one finds new citations of the book. So I think also there are responses in contemporary poetry to this concept also. So, but I think the volume also this book on theory of lyric is maybe there are more people who are not familiar with. So, what I wanted to say, ask you is somehow has to do with how do you see the cultural significance of poetry, because this seems to be going back permanently, and for example, here at this festival, Pestet, most of the events are focused on novelists. So that's I think a general development in this field. But your book delivers some arguments that point toward the fact that there is something in the experience of poetry, in the experience of the lyric, that is, let's say, irreplaceable. So, what is your view on the situation of lyric poetry today, and of interpret or the dealing with lyrical text in general?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not really very well equipped to talk about the situation in poetry today in general. I'm not even really in the United States. I haven't been much concerned with contemporary poetry. My feeling is that there's enough old poetry that I want to read and want to reread, that I don't really need new poetry. And that is itself a comment on the situation of poetry today, I suppose. But it does mean that I lack appreciation of the contemporary poetry scene. Which is I regret that. I do regret that. Let me say a couple of things, and then I will get to this question, nonetheless, even though I say I can't answer it. I just mentioned that there's a long chapter in Theory of the Lyric called Lyric Address, which incorporates material from the original apostrophe essay, which then was a bit revised for in the pursuit of science, but broadening that to talk about other kinds of lyric address to a lover, address to the reader, etc. So if people are really interested in apostrophe, they could look at that. This book apparently is now being translated into Turkish. It can be in Turkish, it can be in Hungarian, why not?
There is a Czech translation also.
That's true, the Czech translation is out, yes, that's true. I have that at home, and of course can't read it and do anything with it, but yes, the Czech translation is out too, so it's, anyway, possible. Or at least somebody could translate the lyric address chapter if they wanted to. The situation of poetry it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, the students say that often undergraduates, at least in the U.S., say they don't like poetry, and I tend to think that happens often because when they've been exposed to it in schools, it's been as an object of interpretation, where the teacher says, "So what's this about? What's this point? How does this poem mean?" what is this about? And they have to sort of guess what the teacher has in mind, and it's not the best way to come to an appreciation of poetry. It's clear that young people do have great appreciation for linguistic play, the kind of active, highly rhythmical, vigorously rhymed linguistic play of rap music, for example, and pop music in general. They know those. There's a wonderful website called Lyricology 101, which is produced by a young rapper who dissects rap songs each week or each month, each thing, and talking about the rhythmical achievements. It's not an interpretation. It's talking about the rhythmical achievements, and here this person has a 5-syllable rhyme, two 5-syllable words rhyming each other, which is super ultra rich rhyme, as it were, not just riche, but ultra rich rhyme, and that's. I use that in my poetry. I would refer students to that in my poetry courses to show them that here is a sort of quasi-academic approach by a young black rapper to rap music, analyzing it, but without trying to interpret it and trying to say why so-and-so, Eminem, this is really a great song of Eminem's because he does such and such. Anyway, so I think that for me, I think that if one were to focus more on the lyric poetry as something to be performed. In the first half of the 20th century, at least in the U.S., this was a regular feature of school curriculum that children at these U.S. states even had requirements in their state curriculum that in every grade students should learn at least 100 lines of poetry each year or something of that sort. And there were competitions. Recitation competitions and things of that sort, and it's too bad that it went out sort of with memorization in general. I think that sort of approach to poetry. But in my own teaching of my undergraduate lyric course on lyric, which I taught for many years, that was one of the things students had to do. They memorized poems, and they didn't really perform them because I didn't want too much pressure, but they would recite them to me or to the teaching assistant in the hallway or before class or something of that sort. But at least they learned poems, and they usually ended up liking that quite a lot. They would choose to do that rather than other exercises that were possible. So I do think that yes, that if one were to stress more, and so part of the problem perhaps of the contemporary situation of poetry is that most contemporary poems are not much invested in rhythmical or sonorous language of one sort or another. There tends to be an opposition, at least in American culture, an opposition to that. When poets give poetry reading, they don't perform their poems as someone like Dylan Thomas used to. They very deliberately, even if they happen to know their poems by heart, they very deliberately show that they are just reading this. This is something I wrote in Cape Cod in 1999, and then they sort of read it in a very undramatic fashion with no gestures, body language, it's just as it is a text, and not a performance that could involve the audience, shall we say. And so I think if poetry were approached more on analogy with music, say, or on analogy with song, there would be more of a chance of building in appreciation of poetry for contemporary students.
Do you have a favorite in contemporary poetry?
Favorite contemporary poet? Well, I'm very fond of some of the poems of my colleague A.R. Ammons, who was a Cornell poet who died a few years ago, whom I used to teach as the final poet of my major poets course, partly because he wrote some of his poems were about Ithaca, New York, and about Cornell, and when Archie was alive, he could come into the course and appear as a living poet, as it were. There's some Ashbery that I'm quite fond of and interested about. Ashbery is a poet who is not, alas, not terribly invested in the sound structure. He's very good at peculiar combinations of word and strange images and juxtapositions. But so some Ashbery is. But again, I'm not a vast reader of Ashbery. I find poems that I like and focus on them. So, but among 20th century poets, I would say Auden is a great favorite, partly because of the variety of things that Auden can do, and I always loved Frost a lot. And I suppose among all English poets, I would say Hopkins is my favorite, partly because of the sound patterning and Hopkins is a delight to read aloud and perform and memorize, etc. And I'm getting even out of the 20th century into the 19th.
Auden, by the way, wrote a foreword to an anthology of Hungarian, translated Hungarian poetry. Early 50s.
Really? I didn't know that, no.
And the first collection in Hungarian of Ashbury came out 1 or 2 years ago, so there is a chance for Hungarian readers to...
Hard to imagine what Ashbury would be like in Hungarian. It's very hard to... The translators would have many difficult choices to make.
There are some volumes by Ashbury which do not give much support for that. So, for example, the tennis court oath, which is the second volume of it.
Yeah, I see.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'm afraid we are running out of time, so I think I will we have to close now our session. So thank you so much for engaging with us in dialogue, and all of you who would like to have your copies signed by Professor Culler. This is right place and opportunity. So if you if you have your copies with you, then he will gladly sign them. Thank you.